Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're very welcome to our symposium this evening in the historic surroundings of Rosemary Street Church. There has been a church here really since the very early 18th century. This was a street of Presbyterian churches during Belfast's golden age, and that's the period we're really returning to this evening. I am your first speaker, Eamon Phoenix. I'm being assisted by our wonderful harpist, Edel Brady, who will be recalling the airs and atmosphere of the 1792 Harp Festival, when that wondrous July in the Athens of the North, as they call this town, Belfast, vibrated really to the strains of harp music for 3 days in the old assembly rooms round the corner. My fellow speakers are Dr. Frank Costello, who's an Irish historian, born in the United States of Irish parents. He's written extensively about modern Irish history, and he's also written about really the American Revolution, and he'll be looking at its impact on the north of Ireland this evening. And our final speaker is Dr. James Dingley, who is a political sociologist attached to the Francis Hutcheson Institute. And he is an expert on Francis Hutcheson, the County Down-born philosopher, who was really one of the fathers of the, if not the father, of the Scottish Enlightenment. So that's really who's who this evening. I want to really take you back to a different Belfast. At the end of the 18th century. At the end of the plantation period, about the 1680s, one writer said that Belfast was a barbarous nook in the north of Ireland. But really, by 1750, the town, which was a mainly Scots town, in fact, the Scottish accent was very noticeable down to the aftermath of the Great Famine of the 1840s, 1850s, which brought different people into the town from other parts of Ulster, other parts of Ireland. But it was very much a Scots town. And it was centred on the High Street, really, with, by the 1760s, the White Linen Hall, where the City Hall now stands, as linen was becoming a major industry, a cottage industry at that time, across the province of Ulster. And of course, by 1765, we had the addition of the assembly rooms, still standing at the four corners bounded by Waring Street, Donegal Street, North Street, and now sadly very much neglected. This was the Belfast Exchange, the assembly rooms that saw so many of the great events of this golden age at the end of the 18th century in this town. It saw the rejection of slavery in 1786 by one of the Belfast radicals, Thomas McCabe. In fact, we never became a slave trading port like Liverpool because of McCabe's intervention when the idea was put in 1785 or 6. And then, of course, it was the site of the Harp Festival of 1792. And finally, the assembly room saw the trial of Henry John McCracken, son of one of the most preeminent, if you like, commercial and cultural families in the town, the McCrackens, who on the distaff side, the Joys, had founded the Belfast Newsletter in 1737, the oldest continuously published newspaper in the world. And of course, it was actually Henry Joy who designed, of course, Belfast's most beautiful Georgian building, the oldest building still in use, which is Clifton House in 1774. So an awful lot of history around this area. And by the 1750s, in the Kingdom of Ireland, because this is the period of the three kingdoms, Belfast was just about beginning to punch above its weight. The Donegals, of course, exercised a political stranglehold over the town. And there was a tension between the Presbyterian townspeople, with names like McCracken and McCabe and Nielsen, and the Donegal family, who had been gifted the town in the distant days of Sir Arthur Chichester. And of course, by that period, by the 1750s, the town was probably a town of about 10,000 people, but by the 1780s, it was over 15,000. By the end of the 1790s, 20,000 people. And of course, this small mainly Presbyterian town, a very small Roman Catholic minority who had lived outside the ramparts. It wasn't a walled town like Derry, it was a ramparted town in the 17th century. They were beginning to come in to ply their trades as carters or as tinsmiths, or perhaps as publicans, one or two attorneys, as the penal laws began to relax. But they were very conscious of the penal history that had darkened their lives, really, from the Boyne right through to the 1770s, when they had worshipped in the old sand-pitted Friars Bush graveyard, raided on occasion by the military, the tradition of a friar hanged there, very, very strongly emblazoned in the kind of folk memory of Belfast Catholics. Friars Bush, still a very revered place there. But the Presbyterians, the majority in the town, also suffered under the leash of the penal laws. Not to the same extent. The Catholics were excluded from the ownership of land, the professions, the right to vote, sit in Parliament, all of that, and education. But the Presbyterians found that they were denied two things. They couldn't hold simple, if you like, public servant posts like postmen. And secondly, their marriages were not recognised. They were deemed, in the old phrase, to be living in sin. And they found that very galling. They were generally excluded from Ireland's only university, the Elizabethan Trinity College, Dublin, the University of Dublin, and would have to find their education at the universities of Glasgow and Edinburgh. And of course, these colleges produced this intelligentsia among the Belfast Presbyterians at the end of the 18th century. People like Dr. William Drennan, a son of the manse, born on this site, studying in Scotland, becoming a physician, then a gynecologist, and practicing ultimately in Dublin, where he became a founder in 1792 of the Dublin Society of the United Irishmen. He was born in this street, which was then known as Rosemary Lane, very busy on Sundays with the three Presbyterian meeting houses, as they were called. And in many ways, this joint exclusion from the state within a kingdom of Ireland dominated by the aristocracy, by the Anglican ascendancy, by the old Irish Parliament in Dublin, it began to see a kind of, if you like, fragmentary alliance between dissenters, the Northern Presbyterians, and the great mass of Irish Catholics, who were producing their own middle class by the middle of the century. One loophole in the penal laws was the wine trade and the ownership of taverns and hotels, which was falling increasingly to Catholics who were making considerable fortunes in cities like Waterford or on the Lecale Peninsula of County Down. And this is the town which at the end of the 18th century is heavily impacted by the gales of change wafting from America, the American Revolution, the American War of Independence, which Frank will be talking about, and indeed from France, the outworkings of the fall of the Bastille, the French Revolution. Now, of course, the main impact of the American War of Independence in Belfast was to see the birth of the volunteers, the Irish volunteers, initially established as a kind of a territorial army to defend the shores of Ireland, spreading from Carrickfergus and Belfast across Protestant Ireland. Soon they're demanding, as the threat of French invasion receded and the American war ended in victory for the colonists, their army stiffened by those Ulster Presbyterians who had been crossing the Atlantic, fleeing penal laws and harsh laws during that long 18th century. But then, of course, the volunteers turned themselves to political purposes. They demanded free trade for Ireland, achieved in 1778. And then they demanded legislative independence, the right of the Irish Parliament to pass its own laws, something that was denied from the 15th century. Would this Parliament have evolved into a Parliament of all the people as democracy emerged slowly? We would never know that because it disappeared under the Act of Union of 1800, following a year of bloodshed in which 30,000 people died. But within Belfast, of course, I suppose Thomas Davis summed it up best when he wrote about those periods, about the Patriot Party and the Irish Parliament. Those Protestant lawyers like Henry Grattan and Henry Flood and Lord Charlemont, who began to urge an ending of the penal laws after half a century of peace since the Boyne. penal laws and persecution of religious minorities from France to Ireland were going out of fashion. So the penal laws were kind of placed in suspended animation. They weren't quite deleted from the statute book, but they were suspended. And Catholics began to make progress, as did Presbyterians. Thomas Davis, the young Ireland poet, would write afterwards, "Bless Henry Flood, who nobly stood by us through gloomy years. Bless Charlemagne, the brave and good, the chief of the volunteers. The North began, the North held on, the strife for native land, till Ireland rose and crushed her foes. God bless the northern land." This is, of course, a revolutionary of the 1840s, looking back on the volunteers, some of whom became the United Irishmen. And of course, it's the impact of the French Revolution that transformed Belfast even more than any other Irish city. Wolfe Tone, of course, would arrive in Belfast in the early 1790s. A Dublin lawyer and propagandist, a radical, the son of a coach builder, and in his heart a separatist. And of course, when Tone came here on the 14th of October, 1791, he came to a tavern in Crown Entry, and he came there with Samuel Neilson, Henry John McCracken, John Rabb, Thomas McCabe and others, to found the Society of United Irishmen. They believed in two things which were very radical. First of all, they wanted a total reform of the representation of the people in Parliament. But more importantly, they wanted to unite Catholic, Protestant and Dissenter, all those peoples of Ireland, under the common name of Irishmen. And they wanted to do something else that we hear on television and read about in the news every day, which is darkening us as we go forward from a past of conflict. And that is, they wanted to, quote, to banish the memory of past dissension. To banish that was a big ask. To somehow draw a line over that bloody past of plantation, confiscation, sectarian massacres by Catholics in 1641, by Cromwell in 1649, right through the Boyne. To banish the memory of the long 18th century. Nonetheless, the movement took root in this time, and it was accompanied by a cultural renaissance. This is the most radical period in Belfast history, when it enjoyed a cultural renaissance, Protestant interest in Irish culture, the Irish language, still spoken by perhaps over 60% of the population of the island, including the Glens of Antrim. And of course, it saw cross-community harmony. Those volunteers in this time built the first Roman Catholic church, Old St Mary's in Chapel Lane in 1784. And the volunteers presented arms as Father Hugh O'Donnell, a typical parish priest of penal times, educated by a hiding friar in the Glens of Antrim and then at Salamanca in Spain, as he celebrated Mass, the first Mass in Belfast really since the Reformation. And he thanked the volunteers. And he said that the friendship and generosity of the Anglicans and Presbyterians of the town, in his words, from the pulpit that day, it was a mark of regard which should never be effaced, which should never be forgotten. That's what we mean by Belfast's golden age. And quickly it deepens into radical politics. In July 1791, from the assembly rooms around the corner, I'm talking about 200 yards, the volunteers who were still marching in Belfast and were still reformers, they marched up Grand Parade. Think of Donegal Place today. They marched up there past what's now Boots and Marks and Spencer to the old White Linen Hall, carrying the flags of what they called the 5 free nations: Ireland, England, Poland, France, and of course the new United States of America. And the event finished with a Feux de Joie. This seemed to be bonfires which were lit on the fields of Antrim and Down to celebrate the French Revolution. This celebration was reported in the Courrier de l'Europe, which was a French newspaper, and it was spotted by the citizens of Nantes and Bordeaux. And they returned their thanks to the citizens of Belfast and said they were there to overthrow all tyranny and plant the seed of democracy. And this was welcomed by the Belfast radicals. And against this background, of course, Steps were taken by people like Edward Bunting, scarcely 20, the organist in St Anne's, born in Armagh, living on this lane with the McCrackens, down about where White's Tavern is now. Some of you may be retiring there afterwards, so I name check it. And the McCrackens lived there, and one of their cultured guests, house guests, was Edward Bunting. Dr James MacDonald, from a mixed marriage in Red Bay in the Glens of Antrim, the son of Micheál Rua MacDonald, one of the MacDonalds of Surly Boy MacDonald, who had come from Scotland to North Ulster in the Middle Ages. And of course, his mother was Elizabeth Stewart of Ballantoy. He had been taught the harp by Art O'Neill, the famous County Tyrone harpist, who would play at the Harp Festival. And they advertised for harpists, we call them harpers in Ireland, from all parts of Ireland to come to Belfast. There had been other harp festivals in the Midlands. They wanted one in the assembly rooms, and they picked a good date, the 11th to the 14th of July, 1792. Now, I hear you saying that might have clashed with the 12th. No chance of that, because the Orange Order had not yet been born. And among those who attended that harp festival, of course, was Theobald Wolfe. We have his diary on that occasion. As the harpists played on the stage, most were Irish. There was one woman, Rose Mooney. You had Dennis O'Hempsey from McGilligan up on the north coast, in his late 90s, who had played the harp for Bonnie Prince Charlie. He played with the long nails. And of course you had Art O'Neill himself. And as they played, their airs were recorded by Edward Bunting. He would later publish them as the harp music of ancient Ireland. And everyone interested in traditional Irish harp music has to thank the Presbyterians of Belfast, who called that harp festival here in 1792. One man who was less impressed and possibly under the influence was Theobald Wolfe. He arrived in Belfast on the 11th, staying in the Donegal Arms Hotel, more or less opposite kind of, I suppose, his mother care is still there, I'm not quite sure. But anyway, there around at Cornmarket. His friend Thomas Russell, an ex-British soldier, librarian to the Linen Hall Library, who would become another United Irishman and lose his life in the 1803 rebellion. This is what Tone wrote. July the 11th, all go to the Harpers at 1. Poor enough. 10 performers, 7 execrable, 3 good, one of them Fanning, Charles Fanning, by far the best. No new musical discovery. I believe all the good Irish airs are already written. July 13th, the Harpers again, strum, strum, and behind. Nonetheless, this was the zenith, the apogee of this cultural renaissance, which would see, of course, Belfast become the most radical, the most liberal, the most inclusive town in Ireland. Of course, the reforms which Tone and Nielsen and McCabe wanted would not be granted. Legally, the Irish Parliament wanted to maintain its own powers, and of course, their demand for Catholic emancipation was not granted in law. And we move in 1795 to a slightly different note. When the United Irishmen were driven underground, you had General Lake's harrying of the North, and you have the bloody rebellion of 1798. Now, to reprise some of the airs from that beautiful festival, Edell's going to play some, because so many tunes which we know, like Tour d'Eau de Lave, Give Me Your Hand, like the Coulin, like Chivé Chimor, were played up the street on that July weekend in 1794, and it captures the Aidan. So she's going to play a few airs before we introduce our next speaker, Edell.
it by bunting. It is the fair-haired lady, or sometimes the lady of the desert, and it's actually debated as to whether Charlie O'Carlin was the composer of that piece. I'll play another tune which is definitely a Charlie O'Carlin piece. Charlie O'Carlin was one of the famous harpers just earlier than the gathering, so his music was collected. He was a blind harper, and he used to go around a lot of the landlords and ladies, and they would put him up, and he'd perform then and compose tunes for them. So this one is called Eleanor Plunkett. It's one of his most famous.
Thanks very much, Adele. Be in touch. Thank you very much, Adele. That was absolutely superb. And we'll probably hear Adele at some future event here, because it's tremendous to listen to the harp and the tunes of that period.